It is important to be able to evaluate the performance of the supervised learning models that we create. There are many different metrics that we can use to score a regression or classification model's performance. For a classification task, for example, we are often interested in measuring the model's accuracy, that is, the proportion of observations for which the model generates correct predictions. Intuitively, it might make sense to evaluate the model on the same data that it is trained on, but that is not advisable. We are interested in knowing how well the model will perform on new observations that it has never seen before. Evaluating the model on the same data on which it was trained will be very likely to provide an overly optimistic assessment of how well the model will generalize to new data. For this reason, it is important to evaluate the model on data that was not seen during training. Such data is referred to as out-of-sample data. It is common practice to split our data set into 3 sets prior to training a model. We will create a training set, a validation set, and a test set. All models that we are interested in considering for a particular task will be trained on the same training set. We will then evaluate these models using their validation scores. In other words, we'll evaluate them based on their performance on the validation set, which contains out-of-sample observations that the algorithms did not see during training. We will then compare the validation scores for each of these models and will typically select the model with the greatest validation score. Using validation scores for model selection can be thought of as an extension of the training process, and it's possible that the final model we select will perform unrealistically well on the validation set simply as a result of random chance. This is especially true when we are comparing many different models. For that reason, we will use the test set to provide a final evaluation for our selected model. The test set should only be used once at the very end of the process after we have selected our final model. There is no set rule for how many observations should go into each of these 3 sets, but there are a couple of guiding principles that you should follow. You want to have as many observations as is reasonably possible within the training set. Models tend to perform better when they are allowed to train on more observations, so you would like the training set to be as large as possible. However, you also don't want the validation or testing sets to be too small to give you reasonable estimates of the out-of-sample performance. If the data set you're working with is fairly large, you might use 80% of it for training, 10% for validation, 10% for testing. In a very large data set, 10% of the data set, using 10% for validation and 10% for testing, will still give you a reasonably sized data set for estimating out-of-sample performance. However, if you have a very small data set, then you might need to use more than 10% of your observations for validation and more than 10% for testing. In those cases, you might consider doing a 60-20-20 split or even a 40-30-30 split.